Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. My apologies for the slightly late response. That was my fault. Had one of those pesky little updates where my computer decided to reboot. So thank you for your patience there, David. I appreciate that. But yeah, today's a special event because I don't know if everyone knows what's been going on. Most of my audience does, but there has been a lot of news about the Shroud and specifically the Waxis dating technique. And, you know, a lot of people have been covering that. We've been getting a lot of positive news coverage, especially in the UK, which is kind of where it started. But then we enter in with my guest, Dr. David Falk, who approaches it from a different perspective. He is a Shroud skeptic. You would define yourself as a skeptic or agnostic? Or...
Neither.
Okay.
I don't. I'm an evidentialist.
Evidentialist. Okay, perfect. So
I go wherever the evidence leads.
Oh, sorry. I think you froze.
Oh, I go wherever the evidence leads.
Gotcha.
So if the evidence favors the Shroud, I'll go with the Shroud. If it doesn't favor the Shroud, I won't favor the Shroud. It's just wherever the evidence goes, I'll go.
Awesome. All right, cool. So with that said, though, that's what we're going to be talking about today is the evidence for and against the Shroud and getting, David's opinion on that kind of thing and where he stands on that. And this will be kind of a part one of two because I am going to be having the authors of the wax paper, Liberato De Caro and Giulio Fonte, coming on later on, giving their answers, at least to the wax part of this discussion. So yeah, look out for part two. But with that said, let me introduce my guest, turn it over to you to kind of introduce the audience as to who you are, a little bit about your academic background, and share some of your faith journey, if you don't mind.
Sure, I'd love to. Well, I was raised in a Christian home, basically an artist's home. Okay, I was raised as an artist. Okay, I'm a fourth generation artist. Before I did my academic work, I was a computer engineer. I worked at Oracle Corporation, GE, IBM, and at several companies within the pharmaceutical industry, like Abbott Laboratories and TAP Pharmaceuticals. Okay, so I have a lot of the similar background to what the STERP people had, but that's sort of where it ends. After that, I did 3 master's degrees and a PhD in Egyptology. Those master's degrees are related to archaeological disciplines. I'm a Bible-believing Christian. Okay, I believe in the historic Christian faith right down the line. Okay, and however, because of my profession, I had to move a lot from city to city. So that being the case, I didn't have the luxury of staying in one denomination all my life. So every time I had to move, it was like, okay, my previous denomination is not in this town. So I had to sort of sign up with a new one. That gave me a world of experience. Okay, it was like, okay, how do I still be doctrinaire and be, have this relationship with all these different denominations? Well, that kind of forced me into that, being more Christian in a pure sense, in a say a historic sense, than say subscribing to the particulars of any one form of Christianity.
I think you're kind of freezing up again. Oh, you're back.
Why? That's okay. That's kind of odd. Okay.
Yeah, I think you're back now.
All right. So that's sort of my. Sorry.
Just out of curiosity. Sorry if you don't. I hope you don't mind me interrupting. But just kind of curiosity, like where did you start? You mentioned you hopped around from denomination to denomination. Where did you kind of start, and like where did you end up now? Because I see someone in the audience is saying that you're of an unknown denomination. I'm not sure that's true.
Absolutely, I'm unknown, and I'm going to keep it that way.
Okay, fair. Okay, I thought, fair enough.
Here's the reason.
Yeah. Go
The
ahead.
reason we keep that unknown is if I say, okay, I'm this denomination, it basically it'll get tribal. It'll get tribal, especially on a channel like ours. So if we say, oh, we're X denomination, people go, oh, that's the right denomination. You see, Dr. Falk says it. No, I'm not going to say that. Okay? It also gives us the freedom to criticize our own denomination. Because frankly, we are of the particular view that no denomination gets it 100% right.
Yeah.
So we think that there's strengths and weaknesses to every denomination. And because we think there's strengths and weaknesses to every denomination, we have to have the freedom to criticize any denomination, including our own.
Yeah.
So that's why we remain an unknown denomination as such.
Fair enough. All right. Yeah. I totally agree.
But I'll say this though. We have been part and when I say we, that means me and my wife, who's my producer. Okay? So when you hear the illustrious producer, that's my wife. Okay?
Awesome.
And she has graduate degrees of her own, okay? Between the three of us, we got 8 degrees.
Is she in a similar field, if you don't mind me asking? Or
she's in the field of bioethics.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, we sometimes say I deal with dead people. She deals with future people.
That is a good way to put it. So, yeah. Sorry. Carry on. I'll mute myself and let you give your intro. No more interruptions.
So between the two of us, we have experience in fundamentalism, evangelicalism, Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. Between the two of us, there's practically nothing we've missed as far as the scope of Christian experience. So we're not against any particular vein of Christianity, but at the same time, too, we're not going to cheerlead for any particular vein either. We believe in the sufficiency of the historic Christian faith. I'm done. You're still mute. You're still mute. Hello. I can't hear you anymore.
Yep. Hello. Am I back?
Okay, you're back.
Okay. So yeah, sorry about that. I think it might be on my end. So okay. Yep. Go ahead and finish off the intro and let me try to.
I did.
Did you? Okay. All right.
I told you I'm done.
Sounds good. I'm sure it was great what I missed, but yeah, it is interesting. Just kind of getting your background there. So thank you for sharing that. And one thing that I did pick up on, because I'm like yourself, a hardcore evidentialist. So I do believe. Oh, go ahead. I do believe that's the proper epistemology, right? We should always base our beliefs or disbeliefs on the evidence itself. So,
and be willing to change when the evidence becomes clear.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would totally agree with that evidential approach.
Okay, so on that front, regardless of denomination, you are clearly a Christian, right?
I am clearly a Christian. I am unapologetically a Christian.
Awesome, and you believe in the literal.
And atheists hate that.
They do, yeah. Yep. Okay, so I do want to kind of turn it to you though. And so, like, if it's not based on the evidence from the Shroud, what is the evidence that you base your Christian faith in general?
Then, my faith is in, say, the Word of God itself. So I take the Word of God and I basically examine it according to the historic evidence. And it's shown to be reliable. So because the Bible is reliable, I can trust its witness. And it's a witness that's been trusted through the centuries. So the early church fathers trusted the Bible. And because the early church fathers trusted the Bible, that led to the later saints trusting the Bible, and so on and so on. It's a received text. And it's a received text that is historically reliable. It's one of the reasons why we focus so much on history. The Christian faith is a historic faith. It's once for all given to the saints in history, time, and space. So if it is historically good, valid, then we can trust it for other things too.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like the general historical reliability of the text when it gets certain certain
You're
historic.
fading in and out.
Oh, okay. So is that better now?
So far, but you were fading in and out for some reason.
Okay. If it happens again, I'll just take out my the microphone, and it might be a little bit fainter, but geez, this is not my day with technology, is it? Perfect.
It's us having is fun with you.
Yeah. Oh man. But yeah, so I can hear that. But what would you say then if so obviously atheists are going to approach it and be like, hey, that's totally irrational. Okay, so sure, the Bible gets the name of a town right, or it gets this or that minor historical detail correct. But when you're talking miracles, like the resurrection or something like that, that's a major leap in faith. You can't believe something like that.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I mean, even when we talk about something like a miracle, okay, a miracle is not really a historical question. It's a question that sort of sits outside of history. So it's one of those levels where if once you've accepted the historicity and the historical reliability of the Bible, then you have to sort of take it on different terms once you go beyond that. So the whole idea of, say, the accounts of miracles and the testimony of miracles then has to be viewed of, well, is then the witness reliable? If the witness is reliable, then you can infer that miracles are also reliable. But that's an inference. But that's an inference based on fact. So even, say, the belief in miracles is not a blind faith, but it is a faith that you have to sort of infer from the facts.
Gotcha. Yeah, believe it or not, yeah, like I hear you. And when you say it's not miracles aren't a matter of history, do you think that's more just like a methodological constraint of the historical discipline, or
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's definitely a constraint of the historical discipline. It's really something you can't prove from history. When it comes right down to it, you can't prove a miracle from history.
Okay.
It's not something that leaves a footprint as such. Like Jesus walking on the water is the classic example. You're not going to find wet footprints on the Sea of Galilee.
Okay. So, but certainly it did leave footprints in the sense of historical testimony or something like that. Do you think that?
But that's a testimonial thing. But that's again a second step from say a historical perspective.
Okay.
So you're on the one hand, when you do history, you are looking at it through, say, evidences, hard evidences. Yes, you will use testimonials too, but it's also hard evidences backing that up. In the case of, say, miraculous events, you lack those hard evidences, and you are just left with, say, the testimonies. Yeah. So then you have to infer from, say, the testimonies and, say, the related, say, data that miracle happened. So it's really outside the whole methodological discipline of history.
Yeah, it's kind of at the interpretational level. It's you're kind of engaging in logic, or like making an inference to the best explanation on the historical data
Yeah.
itself.
It becomes a religious question. It becomes a religious and theological question, no longer a historical question. So it changes discipline at that point.
Gotcha. Okay. So one last kind of follow up on this, if you don't mind. Hopefully, you're enjoying the questions. But what is your take on? So I'm friends with Dr. Guru.
Yeah, I hate questions.
Yeah.
That's why I do it every Friday.
Sounds good. Well, Thursday is the case may be, but yeah. So I'm friends with Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona. I know you know of them, and they're famous for the something like the minimal facts approach for the resurrection, where they split it up, right? So they've got the pure history part. Okay, we can get the facts, and then we have, okay, how do we explain the facts? Hallucination, whatever, conspiracy, whatever it is. What are your thoughts on using that as an apologetic tool and as a way to come to faith?
I am not a great fan of the minimal facts approach. All right, just to be straight up, take what would be called the maximal facts approach, where you gather as many facts together and build an inductive case. Okay, that is much more congruent with, say, a methodology consistent with ancient history. Okay, so I've never been comfortable with the minimal facts approach because agreement for that minimal fact is, wow, it's awfully sketchy. Okay, you can get 1,000 people agreeing on that minimal fact, but in different ways.
Yeah.
So it's really not the same interpretation across the board. So in that case, is it a minimal fact? I think it's a much safer and more solid approach to go with the maximal facts. Do as many facts as you can, as much supporting evidence as you can, and then draw your inferences from that.
Gotcha. All right, fair enough. Yeah, I've had Lydia McGrew on the show as well. She also advocates for the maximal approach. So, all right, awesome. Well, I think we kind of get like where you're coming from in general as a Christian scholar and archaeologist. So now we come to the fun part. This is why we're here. So the Shroud of Turin and the evidence on that. In the first place, the way I see Shroud studies is that there's two questions that you need. So there's the question of historical authenticity or not. I'm not going to compare authentic or fraud because I know that you have a middle path kind of thing, right? But that question of authenticity, did it cover the historical corpse of Jesus or not? And the second question is where I think the scientific evidence is even more relevant on the question of, is it an authentic miracle that however those images were formed, can we prove that it's miraculous or not? And I want to get from you, because obviously I think you, from what I've seen in your videos, you would answer in the negative, at least based on the evidence you've been privy to, that you don't think the Shroud historically covered Jesus, and you lean in the direction that they're not formed miraculously. You think it's some kind of artwork. So in the first place, I'm just wanting to confirm with you, how strong is your disbelief on both fronts with the Shroud? If you had to put a percentage on it or something like that, like, do you see it at least possible or plausible that it could be authentic?
Well, okay. 9 months ago, I had no opinion about the Shroud at all. Frankly. I had never looked into it. It wasn't a question for me 9 months ago. It was really just because some people on my channel asked me to look into it that I did. Okay? So, I was really open-minded regarding the Shroud. Okay? But I think there's a problem with the question in general. Okay? That whole question of authenticity, I think, is problematic. I think the question itself leads to a black or white answer that appeals in some sense to tribalism. Basically, the pro-Shroud approach versus the anti-Shroud approach. Okay, and I think that's problematic all by itself. And I think it's problematic because it leads to anachronistic notions of authenticity. Yeah, maybe from our modern perspective, we want to know, is this the cloth that was used to bury Jesus or not? Okay, and that's a totally fair question. But just because you'd say, for example, it's not a first century burial cloth, doesn't mean that the shroud isn't authentic in some other way. So I think the whole question is poorly formed. So and I, as I say, I don't like the whole tribalist approach to that. I think one of the things when we talk about the shroud is we want to start getting away from black or white answers. I think more nuance needs to be injected into this conversation because there's a lot of nuance here. And I mean, from your fabulous questions that you gave me in advance, it shows me how nuanced some of this stuff really is.
Absolutely.
So I don't like the question, the whole authenticity question. It's anachronistic. It leads to tribalism. I think we need to take the shroud on its own terms, whatever those are.
Gotcha. Yeah. So being privy to shroud studies, I do admit, and even I myself fail at times and make this mistake of getting too tribal. And I think we do have to remember that there are more than just the two positions. So, just for example, I don't mind using the terms authentic, but fine, if we have one position, it covered Jesus historically in 30 AD.
Mm-hmm.
That's one position. And then, okay, the skeptical position, no, I think it's a medievalist position, right? It's a medieval fake. But then there's someone like you, okay, well, I take a middle view. I don't think it was around in 30 AD, but I don't think it's medieval either. So you're right. There can be different positions. And same with regard to the two separate questions. So, for example, Barry Schwartz, he answered that it is, I'm going to have to use, I'm comfortable with these terms, but you know what I mean. He would say it's historically authentic in that it covered Jesus, but he didn't believe that it was a miraculous image. He just thought it was formed from Jesus' body naturally. So there are a spectrum of positions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So okay.
I think we need to be flexible here. At least conscious of the fact that there are multiple possessions. And conscious of the fact that there are, various views.
Gotcha.
So if we're conscious of that fact that there are various views, I think we can have a not just a more nuanced conversation about this, but a more generous one too. A more charitable conversation.
Gotcha. All right. So, okay. So, just so I know, you are obviously open as an evidentialist to whatever the evidence says. If it says it's an
wherever the evidence says, I'll go there.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So, so my next question, I'm not going to call you a shroud skeptic, just out of politeness, because I don't think you'll claim that term. So that's fine. But I'm just kind of wondering then. So on the history question, since you don't think the shroud is medieval and you don't think it did cover Jesus, when do you think that the shroud actually originates? And what's the kind of evidence that you base your conclusion on that front?
Okay, well, I think that the shroud is an Eastern Orthodox ritual object that dates sometime between the 7th and the 14th century. And the date for me is really very flexible here. Okay? I think it entered Europe sometime or between 1204 AD and the late Byzantine, and as late as the Byzantine Civil War. There was a lot of traffic going between Byzantium and Europe at the time, so it could have been anywhere in between. So the thing about this view, though, I think it's really important to recognize is if you're pro-shroud, you almost have to subscribe to that at least the view that it is an Eastern Orthodox ritual object all by itself. Even that's a question that's almost assumed in the pro-Shroud view, because otherwise you have no transmission vector for it to get to Europe. The whole idea that the Shroud was preserved in, say, Eastern Orthodoxy is necessary for those who believe that it is a first century artifact. So you almost have to subscribe to it, whether or not. Basically, the only view that basically really strongly negates that view, would be the medieval forgery view. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why I think. I mean, I've heard some people say, "Oh no, it can't be an Eastern Orthodox ritual object." Okay, well, you believe it's the real Shroud of Jesus, right? Oh yeah. Okay, how was it preserved? Oh, it was held by the church. Yes, exactly.
Yep.
The fact is that it being an Eastern Orthodox ritual object then raises the further question: was it recognized by Eastern Orthodoxy or created by Eastern Orthodoxy? That then becomes the pivotal question. So I tend to lean toward that it's a created object, but if you are a pro-Shroud person, you have to recognize that it is at least a recognized Eastern Orthodox ritual object.
Okay. Now I think you kind of hinted at you mentioned the ritual, and did you have like a specific ritual in mind? Like, so for example, on the what was the ritual?
Well, there is a ritual that you find in Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, from what I understand, not all Eastern Orthodox churches, but there are many Eastern Orthodox churches that have a shroud ritual, usually around Good Friday, where basically a shroud is basically presented and paraded around. Now, in my local Eastern Orthodox church, the one that's down the street from me, they have a shroud that's the dimensions are actually really similar to the Turin shroud in size. It's black velvet and it's beaded. Okay, but I understand that not all Eastern Orthodox churches do this, but there's many of them that do. So, but you have to be there at the right time of year to see it. I mean, if you're not there during the right time of year, you'll never see it.
Okay.
But it is part of the liturgical life of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Okay. Is it so? So I know a medievalist named Hugh Ferry. He thinks it's medieval Europe. He kind of says, "Oh well, we have this Quem Queritas ritual in the Catholic Church." So I'm assuming what you're talking about within the Byzantine is sort of similar. It's an Easter service where they.
It's an Easter service, yeah.
Gotcha, and they reenact the Good Friday and Easter Sunday and all that. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Perfect. So that makes sense then as to where you're saying. And and the second part of that is what is the evidence that you base that on historically? Like why do you think it does date back pre-medieval times to the Byzantine Empire?
Some of it is the fact that like the linen itself is very typical of what you would find from artifacts of that time. It's also the fact that the iconography is very similar to what you find in the Byzantine Empire. So it fits with the particular milieu of the time. So we're going to go into this, I think, at some point, but say the god Solidus coins. Very much that sort of iconography was extant. So I would look at it and go, hey, okay, when I see this, it's very reminiscent of Byzantine art. Very reminiscent of it. And it's very reminiscent of, say, the whole sort of ritual life of Eastern Orthodoxy in Anatolia. So when you start looking at components like this, plus we can't also forget that Anatolia was obsessed with relics. It was absolutely obsessed with relics. It produced a lot of relics. And some of those relics were not always legit. Some of them started off as other things that became, say, misunderstood and became associated with the original objects of, say, the crucifixion itself. So this is just part of the history, the religious history of the late Byzantine Empire.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's good, and that's what you mentioned was something that I'm going to be talking to you about in a future question.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, so just before we get to some of this evidence in a little bit more detail, I'm kind of curious because the medievalist position, they will also point to evidence as well, right? So, namely the 1988 carbon-14 dating, the 1389 Darcy Memorandum, stuff like that. Just a couple things to prove, no, this is absolutely medieval. And in fact, some of them will also make the argument similar to what you did, and they'll say, Dr. Falk, what are you talking about? It fits a medieval milieu. It looks like a clearly medieval white European man, and the cloth is like of a medieval design and stuff like that. So what is your take in general on some of these evidence allegedly proving it is clearly medieval? It doesn't go back to the Byzantines in the Dark Ages.
Okay. As far as the carbon-14 goes, I don't reject it. I just don't engage it. When you do deal with public evidence, there's some findings that are so unpopular, so reviled, that people turn you off as soon as they hear that being raised. The evidence itself becomes septic. It's better off not using septic evidence, no matter how sound it is. And carbon-14, with regards to the Shroud, creates a knee-jerk reaction when discussions of the Shroud are made. So I don't engage it because of the negative associations with it. Now, with that said, my hypothesis is flexible enough to accommodate the carbon-14 stuff if it's needed. The Byzantine period goes to 1453. So, as long as the Shroud was created in Byzantium sometime before then, and then moved to Europe, say, during the turmoil of the previous 200 years, that's fine for my hypothesis. Okay? So, but, when you deal with stuff like, say, for example, the Darcy Memorandum, there's going to be counter-apologetics to that, too. The idea that, there was political turnover, so in turmoil in Europe, so this was more a political memoranda that they couldn't recognize it rather than it being, say, evidence of a legitimate fake. So, again, it then becomes he says, she says. So, it's not productive to really use that in, say, public discussions on the Shroud.
Okay, so that's an interesting answer. I'll admit it. I didn't kind of expect it, kind of thing, but I understand it. But yeah, I would just say, okay, so one thing, because you claim to be an evidentialist, though, I'm not sure that you can just kind of, this kind of it's.
I didn't say I rejected it.
Oh, correct. I
said I don't engage it. It's a difference.
Okay. Are you willing to engage a little bit in it on this show?
Sure.
Yep.
Sure, I'd be willing to. Okay.
And
I do think the carbon-14 stuff is valid.
Interesting. Okay.
It's 3 samples sent to 3 labs. Yeah, sure, it's the same corner, but It's 3. Okay. The fact that it might have been contaminated with cotton, uh, unlikely to happen in all 3 samples. It's unlikely. And if it is, there's some deeper issues here than just say mending of the thing itself. Because according to what I've heard about the cotton involved, it's the fibers itself that has been interwoven with the threads.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a huge problem if you're pro Shroud. Because you don't just do that. That's not a simple mending. That is actually creating a linen cotton blend and weaving that in. This would imply that the entire shroud might have been made of a linen cotton blend.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a huge historical problem for the pro Shroud side, because cotton does not come to Europe or is even produced in the ancient Near East until the 7th century with the rise of Islam. So this is one of those areas I think we should be very, very cautious of if you want to make that claim. Very cautious of it. Because it's one of those claims that could, you might have, I think if you're going to attack the carbon-14 results, I'd take a different approach. I don't think that's a good approach. And I think you can be justified in attacking carbon-14 results. I mean, you could just say, oh, well, maybe they wrote on their form, this is when we think it dates. And the labs were biased because of it. Mm-hmm. Be a much better approach than saying, hey, it's cotton contamination. Cotton contamination is going to lead you down a road you probably don't want to go.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I kind of want to go in order and just kind of get your take on some of these things that have been raised against the carbon-14. So one thing in particular is relevant for you because it was an objection that you gave, and I think it was a fair one against the wax method. That look, this wasn't a blind testing. Well, the same is true about the carbon-14 dating.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not.
So what?
Because here's the thing: the blind testing problem is not against the tests of the Shroud. Okay, it's not against that. It's against the method used to test it. There's a difference. There's a difference between the two. What you have to do, and anyone who's done, say, a lot of FDA training knows this. Okay? You have to validate a method to show that it works before you can use it.
Right.
Okay?
Yep.
If you produce a pharmaceutical drug, the FDA wants you to validate your method of production to show that the drug, what you put in, ends up in the drug you expect coming out. Okay? Mm-hmm. The method itself has to be validated so that you know it works. The wax's method hasn't been validated. The carbon-14 method has been. The carbon-14 method has gone through thousands of blind tests. Hundreds of thousands of samples. And we're at the point where we're in almost the millions of samples now that have been tested by carbon-14. Blind samples. Okay? So the blind sampling thing has to do with methodology and the method used, not the testing. So I think you need to keep that really clear.
Okay, so and I take your point about the distinction, but I don't think that it works. And I'll give a couple points, and I'll give you the last word, and then we can move on to the next point. But for two reasons. So number one, you mentioned, look, carbon-14 dating of the shroud was of a specific type, which was new at the time. It was only about 10 years old. It's AMS, carbon-14
Oh,
dating.
okay.
So that was a specific type. And in terms of it having been vetted, we can actually look in the 80s when they were doing intercomparison tests to vet it. They didn't use hundreds of samples. They used like 5 or 3 or something like that. And
No, it'd been gone through quite a bit of testing at that point. It was already a well-vetted method at that point. Carbon-14 has been around for a dang long time. It's been around since 1940. It's been
Okay.
around since 1940. Now, what has changed is, first of all, the size of the samples, but also it's been changed by its corroborating methods. So, in the 1980s, you had the beginning of dendrochronology, where people were starting to take tree rings and started to compare that to a calibration curve. And already in the 1980s, we had a calibration curve for carbon-14. So it's not entirely true that there was no blind methodology, even for that particular method used with the Shroud. The method itself had already undergone calibration. So if you've got a calibration curve, you already have some idea of how well this works.
okay, so you're saying like the even though there was a different type of carbon dating that wasn't the conventional use, you're saying that the previous tests on the conventional techniques was enough to vet for any and all like,
Yeah.
new versions of it. Okay.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the measurement is going to be the same. Whether it is where you had the large sample carbon-14, where you would have, say, that it still produces that ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14.
Right.
Okay. So that ratio is really what you're going to measure here. So while that was a newer method, it had been done at 3 labs. 3 different labs. Okay, you can't tell me it's only been gone through 5 samples from 3 labs. That'd be quite incredulous.
Okay.
Okay, so they've been doing that for some time already when those samples were given.
Okay. What was your take on the intercomparison tests then that were done? Because they did find problems, systematic bias problems and stuff with the AMS in particular. So like, what have you seen those reports, or like what do you make of that, of those issues? And by the way, they tested the other conventional carbon-14 methods too, and they did get dismal results with these things. So like, if you're familiar
Well,
with it,
you are going to get some variation in results. In any carbon-14 test, you're still going to get a plus or minus 100 years. It's generally 50 to 100 years, depending on how close you are to the present. So it really doesn't, you're going to get that anyway, just because of the disparity between carbon-12 and carbon-14. So that's just going to be part of the method. So you are going to get some disparity of results. Doesn't matter which method you use. It's still true today. You do carbon-14 today, you still get those error bars. Almost any dating method of this kind will give you that range of error. And even waxes gives you that range of error. So
much wider too.
Yeah. So it's just part and parcel to chronometric dating.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So my last question, I guess, on this thing is about that blind testing. So I hear you that blind testing in the method itself is perhaps even a bigger problem. But wouldn't you
Huge
say
problem.
but wouldn't the purpose of blind testing for the Shroud in particular, or for like a specific test, even if the method itself has been vetted, isn't that still a problem? Because bias.
No, it's not so much a problem. I mean, look, if you did a blind test of the Shroud, that's fantastic. That makes your results stronger. Okay, but let's say you don't. Okay, who cares? If the method is good and the procedure is good, then you can do a test of a sample without, say, a blind test as such, and still produce a good result. Because the blind testing applies to validation.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Perfect. Oh, okay. All right. And I'll ask this. So, believe it or not, I actually agree with you on the invisible reweave hypothesis. I don't. I think the evidence speaks against it. There are very strong evidential empirical findings that speak against it. So I don't take the, and I know that's the majority position. See, more nuance. See, but I'm kind of interested in your take. So I go for more Bob Rucker's notion that there was a neutron irradiation event, and that's a miracle. So I'm not going to get you to speak on that, but there is evidence from the carbon-14 in the statistical findings that they got, right, based on the range of dates they got, as well as the slope or the gradient of the dates. It's about 36 years per centimeter from where they dated it. And that gradient is statistically significant. It proves that there is some kind of systematic bias or error that is causing these results. And because of that, I don't know if you've seen the journal articles kind of assessing the statistics. Even archaeometry has published that, you can't rely on the carbon-14 dates that they got as the actual dates, because there is this, at least for the moment, keeping it neutral, an unknown systematic bias that's at play. So I'm kind of curious, what's your take on that? Have you heard of the statistical problems that have come out in the peer-reviewed literature? And again,
I haven't heard of Rucker's issue here, to be honest. But I would have to look at that in more detail. But at the same time, too, I don't see how that would significantly impact the results.
Yeah, and even at the best, it's like, okay, it's still going to give you a date sometime in the 1100s. So it's not what we want.
Yeah, it's not that, wouldn't be that big anyway.
Yeah,
but if you're going to go there, you would have to basically say that the carbon-14 was created in situ on the shroud itself. And that's deeply problematic, because carbon-14 forms only under special conditions. So, yeah, that's going to be a problem.
Would you let, okay, and I'm so sorry, I promise I will move on from the carbon-14 after this, but with Bob Rucker's, so this is where the miracle comes in, because he appeals to neutron irradiation, which would create that additional carbon-14. It's a miracle.
How much radiation?
He's calculated that. He's a nuclear engineer, and he's actually put forward a actual scientific hypothesis. So like, he's calculated it. Down to the.
I hope this is not that. I hope this is not that 34 trillion watt hypothesis.
No, that would blow up Jerusalem. So yeah,
exactly. That's not imprinting on a shroud. That's vaporizing half of Jerusalem.
Yeah. He's Bob Rucker. He's well aware of that. So. All right, cool. So
they don't have to bribe the Roman guards. They just wait for them to die of radiation poisoning in an hour.
There you go. Yeah. The simplistic radiation thing, like, look, E equals MC squared, man. It would. Yeah. Half of Judea would be blown up if.
Yeah, I mean, 34 terajoules is half the energy of the Hiroshima bomb.
Yeah, it's insane. Yeah, so I don't know. He has calculated it out. I'm not going to give the numbers just because I forget what it is, but it's a small fraction of the particles converted or something like that. So, yeah. Okay, fair enough. So I'm going to move on from the carbon-14, and I think we agree on the Darcy memorandum. I'm just kind of curious on that front. Do you think you would agree with me that it's proper to look? This is a historical document, like any other document, and we should apply certain criteria to see is this a reliable document, and can we rely on the content that's within it? I'm just kind of curious if you've ever looked at the Darcy Memorandum as a historian. What do you make of it as a historical document?
Um, I'm vaguely aware of it. I really didn't don't really, as I say, it's one of those things where it's, yeah, it is a historical document, but doesn't really tell us what we need to know. Is there a preponderance of evidence here that would lead us to one conclusion or the other? Now, I think it raises doubts. It raises doubts. But I would rather look at, say, more physical evidence here.
Gotcha.
Because, I mean, why did they regard it as a forgery? That's a big question. And I don't think the Darcy document really answers that question.
Yeah, I think.
So,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I think it does say it does attribute it as a painting to an artist that
Yeah, it does.
painted
That
it.
much is clear, but you know, again, it's just one of those things that it's a septic piece of evidence. It's a
Yeah, yeah,
septic piece of evidence. So you could bring it up, but then someone else will say, well, yeah, but it was really a politically motivated piece of evidence.
for sure. Yeah, I mean,
Maybe,
there's ample
yeah, maybe
motivation.
not. We
Yeah,
don't know.
well,
There's not sufficient evidence there to say one way or the other. It might be, it might not be.
yeah. Well, I
Just
think
because there's a political milieu that would say be against the Shroud at that particular time doesn't mean that that particular evidence is fake. That testimony that it's fake it's in some ways it's an ad hominem attack against that evidence. It's ascribing motives to that memorandum that are not sort of drawn out of the memorandum itself.
yeah, yeah,
In some ways, you're going to have to become like a mind reader to get that out of it. So a good historian is not just going to blanket say, "Oh, this guy said it's fake. It's politically motivated. He had mens rea, evil motives in writing it." Yeah, good historians don't do that. Now, if you can conclude that in some other way, basically, some other document that says, "Oh, I know this writer. He's politically motivated here," then you might have some justification for it. But just on its own, we don't have that.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree, and I think in agreeing with you, for me, the nail in the coffin of that is really appealing to the external documents because we've got these external documents, including from this bishop's predecessor, who's supposedly the one who conducted this inquiry and that the artist confessed to that they made the shroud. But we have a letter from him, just written a few months before he died, saying the opposite, saying, "Hey, I totally approve of everything you're doing at the church, and in terms of the divine cult, you're doing a great job. Keep it up." So like that was kind of the clincher for me is those external documents. So would you agree with that, or would you, even with those external documents, you think, well, there could still be truth to it, or do you think it's just a
I
dead?
can't say.
Fair
I
enough.
can't say. I haven't looked at those documents myself.
Okay, perfect. All right, so at this point, I'm going to keep my promise and let's move on now to going beyond the medieval, because you are open. I think you said as early as the 7th century, and you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned something that makes me smile as a pro shroud guy, that the gold solidus coin. So I just kind of want to get your take. What are your thoughts on some of the evidences that um, you know uh, pro shroud proponents or people that think the shroud dates back beyond the medieval period, centuries earlier than the medieval period? What is your take on some of the evidences that they present? Do you think there are any good ones? And yeah.
I think all evidences need to be taken on a case by case basis. Case by case basis is the only approach to evaluating evidence. Okay. So I'm going to take each of these in its basically on its own merits. Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are going to be bad. Some of them are going to be downright stinkers. Okay. Now, when I look at, for example, the God Solidus coins, I kind of don't think that's great evidence. Okay. The fact is that the Byzantium Empire produced a huge range of these coins with different faces on all of them. The fact you pick out one that's frankly very worn down, and then say, "Oh, this is the image of the shroud," I think is a dubious prospect. Okay, because as I said, there's a huge range of these. It's not just one type of coin; it's many coins over centuries, and they're all different. So I think that's one of those. It's one of those cosmetic similarities leading to a false conclusion. On the other hand, for example, Bill Meacham's isotope linking to the shroud, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a decent. I mean, I have no problem saying that the linen, the shroud came from the Near East. Yeah, cloth had been imported in Europe since the 7th century. And that was one of the huge exports from, say, Islamic ancient the Islamic Near East was cloth, linen cloth, cotton cloth. They were huge exporters of that. So the fact that it came from there, not a problem. I think that's totally reasonable. Totally reasonable. Okay, so I think in some other cases, like the comparison with the sudarium of Ovida, I think that one is a little more problematic. The comparison of the blood stains is not a one-to-one match, despite what some shroud advocates have suggested. I would say this even, that say I think the case for the sudarium is probably stronger than it is for the shroud. All given. One of the things about, say, the sudarium is it does seem that there's blood on the sudarium. We'll say that. And the reason why is because the pigments, and I'm using the word pigment here loosely, is more towards that green-yellow spectrum that you find for oxidized hemoglobin. When hemoglobin oxidizes, it doesn't stay red. It goes to a green-yellow color. And you find that on the sudarium. So I think it's a lot strong. The evidence for the sudarium is a lot stronger as far as it being a cloth with blood on it than, say, the shroud. And we can get into that evidence a little later, exactly what the specifics are on that. But when I look closely at the sudarium and try to match it to the marks on the shroud, it's only a cosmetic similarity. The stains are not on a one-to-one basis. So I've got some reservations about linking that to the shroud. It's not a good enough fit for me to see that as strong evidence.
All right, awesome. So yeah, that was thank you very much for giving your take on that. And I think I think that's the way to do it, right? Is assess it on a case by case basis. So if you don't think
some's good, some's not. Some evidence is fine, some isn't.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. So let me start with the gold solidus coins then, and just kind of ask you. So I hear and take your point and stuff like that, right? I want to ask you though, because I think you did mention earlier that you did think that there were a bunch of Byzantine images that were related to the shroud in some way. You didn't specify what that relationship is. Do you, in terms of the artistic argument in general? Do you think that the Byzantines are making images based on the Shroud images, or do you think that, the vice versa, like the Shroud was just, based on the Pantocrator image or something like that? Do you think there's any kind
I
of
think it's more based on the Pantocrator image. This is an image that's everywhere in Byzantine Anatolia.
Mhm.
So they're using it all over the place. They're using it in coinage. They're using it in iconography. They're using it to decorate their churches. It's everywhere. It's everywhere at that point.
Okay. So my only question on this front then, so you do recognize there is some kind of a relationship, but you think it's the Shroud is being copied from the Pantocrator and stuff like that.
I think that's more reasonable given what we know about the art style of the time.
Okay, so the thing that I'm kind of curious,
It's also the fact that this style is a gradual development too.
okay,
It takes on different features as it moves in time. Earlier coinage has a different facial structure than later coinage.
okay, yep, and even artwork and paintings, I'm kind of including all of
Mm-hmm.
that as the same argument. But here's the thing that I think kind of leans toward the Shroud, and you let me know your thoughts on this. So it comes to the origins, right? So when we look at this Pantocrator style image, the traditional image of Jesus in the Byzantine Empire, we know historically when that originates. It's the 6th century, the mid 500s AD is when that image becomes standardized and starts spreading around in the Byzantine Empire. But before that, as you'll know as an archaeologist better than I do, like there's kind of like a mixed styles. Like they don't really know what Jesus looks like. He's depicted in the Greco-Roman style. There's a Syrian style Jesus, and there's starting in the 300s. I think there are some rare portraits of him in the traditional style and stuff like that. So I'm kind of curious. It makes sense to me as a pro Shroud guy to say, well, what was the reason that those images became standardized and universal throughout the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century? Is, well, they rediscovered the Shroud and they took the Shroud image as the authoritative image. This is Jesus' burial cloth. And so this is what Jesus looked like. And that's why there was this standardization. I'm just kind of curious, but yeah, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that sounds to me like a little bit like special pleading, to be honest. Um, I think that when we talk about, say, images in general, in the what's essentially the Eastern Roman Empire, a lot of it is going to come out of that classical period of art history. It's not just that they have a standardized from a particular cloth, okay? Because frankly, that cloth, the contrast on that cloth is really not that clear. It's really not that clear. It's a low contrast image. They're already doing high contrast, basically, paintings and reliefs long before then.
And sorry to interrupt. Just a quick clarification, and then I'll let you continue. But in terms of the low contrast aspect, so do you think, because I know you think the Shroud's an artistic image, do you think it had that low contrast straight from the beginning, or was that something that happened later on due to wear and tear and stuff?
I think it probably had that in the beginning.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, continue on. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, that's fine. But I think that already, say, early on in early, basically, icons, we're already seeing that there was this sort of cultural image of Christ that was part of the Hellenistic world. So early depictions of Christ are very much, they're not Judaic portraits. They're not what you would find coming out of Judaism. And we do have Judaism, Judaic art of that period in, say, Mosaic. So later on, it's already by the 5th century, 6th century, it's already taken on sort of a Hellenistic feel. So that Pantocrator image is very Hellenistic in its its artistic approach. So it's not something that you would see coming immediately from Christianity. Say early Christianity, like the first and second centuries of Christianity, but later on. So that whole, European sort of look is going to be part of, say, that Hellenism that is basically endemic to just the whole Eastern Roman Empire.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That makes sense. All right. Perfect. So the second of the three things that I got from you there was, so this is the thing you think does work. Bill Meacham's recent isotope study and that sort of thing. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, what do you make of? Okay, so two follow ups then. So one
Mm-hmm.
thing is that with Bill Meacham's study, one of the issues that the skeptics capitalize on is, well, it wasn't exclusive to the Middle East. There was a rare data point that could allow for it to be European. Do you think that that is a problem for the study, or on a balanced probability, this is just a rare outlier or something?
I think on the balance of probabilities, it's the cloth probably did originate from the Near East. Again, it would be consistent. Like even if it's a medieval forgery, the idea that the cloth coming from the Near East is pretty high, especially if it's coming into Italy,
Mhm.
because Italy is the hub through which the cloth trade is coming in. Renaissance Europe was famous for the importing of fabulous cloths. And the women of Venice were just fabulously dressed because they had easy access to affordable fabric. Affordable, beautiful fabric.
Mhm.
So, the whole, it would make sense if the linen for the shroud, if it was a forgery, and I'm not saying it is, if it was a forgery, it would come in through that cloth trade coming into Italy. That would totally make sense. That it would originate elsewhere and then be brought in for this.
Gotcha. And are you familiar with other studies that kind of go for the geographic link rather than the dating, like things like the pollen evidence or the limestone dust studies? Do you think there's merit to those as well, or do you find those less convincing if you've studied them?
The limestone stuff would be less convincing, and that's because you've got a consistent limestone um, shelf that goes right across the Levant.
Mhm.
So that could be anywhere in the Near East, practically. So, and that's the problem I think with some of these studies is they try to get too specific. They try to overread the results. So if you don't overread the results, yeah, you could easily say it's in the Near East somewhere, anywhere from Turkey to Egypt. Anywhere from Turkey to Egypt would work. Would be consistent with all those studies. But that's a
Okay.
huge range. Huge range.
Gotcha. All right, cool. And last but not least, on this, you mentioned what I think is my favorite in terms of linking it to around the sixth century, fifth century, that sort of thing. The sudarium of Oviedo, and
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a fair opinion. You're correct that there isn't this. It's not a one-to-one match. I still remember. I used to think that when I taught my solo show, and I was in for a rude awakening when I saw what the Shroud skeptics had to say. Right, so you're correct. But I have had Dr. Caesar Barta on my show, and he is
Mm-hmm.
like one of the researchers actually studying the sudarium and stuff. And he has kind of evaluated the correspondence there, and he said that with certain blood stains, such as the at the back of the neck, the crown of thorn wounds, there's as high as a 75% correspondence or some of those stains. And then there's
Yep,
also,
that's sort of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
well,
That's
that's
where
what
you sort of circle in the ones that work for you and ignore the ones that don't.
that's okay. So great. So you're coming to my kind of question, because I don't think, and you tell me why you think this, because of course, look, these are two cloths that covered Jesus' corpse while he was in different positions and at different times. it wasn't like the sudarium was on Jesus and then they put the shroud over top, but they would put the sudarium over top of him while he was still on the cross to catch the blood as they're transporting him to the tomb. And I can see on your expression that you don't buy that, but okay.
Not really, no.
So is that historically inaccurate then? They wouldn't have done that with this?
No, they wouldn't have done that. Yeah, that's historically inaccurate. They wouldn't have done that. They would have the way that the burial works. And any ancient Near East or any Israelite of the 1st, 2nd century burial would work this way, regardless of how the person died. Okay? They're basically taken for preparation. They wouldn't take and put a cloth over him and then take him away. We have to remember, cloth was precious. Cloth was precious. You didn't waste it. So to use a cloth temporarily for that purpose would be a waste of cloth. You've made that cloth now ritually impure for any other use.
Right.
We have to understand that the whole idea of the shroud in ancient Judaism, Judaic burials, is basically you're going to take that body down, okay? And then you're going to wash that body. That body's going to get a thorough washing. And Paul even refers to this when he talks about the baptism of the dead. This is washing the body for the next phase. They're going to use oil and spices, and that's just to cut down the stink, okay? And then they're going to wrap it in a linen, okay? Now, the purpose of that linen is to keep all the bones together. That's the purpose of it. You're going to put it into a limestone cave, and the limestone cave is going to accelerate the decay process. That's going to cause the body to rot and leave only the bones. And the purpose of the shroud is to keep all the bones together. So, in the case, let's say an animal gets into the tomb. You don't want some animal coming on, walking off with grandpa's leg. You want to keep all those bones together. So what's going to happen is after a year, after that body has thoroughly decayed, you're going to come back a year later. You're going to gather all those bones, throw away the cloth because it's rotten and useless, and put those bones in an ossuary, a bone box. And then that bone box is going to be moved to the family tomb, where it will be with all your relatives. Mm-hmm. So that's the process of an ancient Near Eastern 1st century burial. So they're not going to put the cloth on the face as it's coming down. They're going to put that on the body after. Just before, they're going to put that before the shroud. So it's going to go, the cloth, the face cloth is going to go between the face and the shroud.
Okay, so here's my problem with that is because you're basically saying, well, the Bible's in error then, because doesn't the Gospels tell us it was put to the side? They did waste that cloth. They put it to the side of Jesus and left it in the tomb. So like, you're contradicting the Bible if you say
no. I'm not contradicting the Bible by that. That doesn't contradict the Bible. Hardly.
Okay.
No, they're basically, you're not going to put a cloth on before you wash the body.
Oh, okay.
You're going to wash the body first, then the cloths.
Okay. So I get that, but you're like so why would they wash the body, then put the sudarium on, then take it off and put it to the side and then cover him in the shroud? Like, what was the purpose that you're saying was for that?
It's actually at the burial that they do this.
Mm-hmm.
So the cloth is put on first. The face cloth is put on first, then the shroud. Okay. So they didn't say when you read the Gospels, what it tells you is that the face cloth was found beside the shroud.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it was put on after. Gotcha.
Okay, so you're saying, so when he was buried, the sudarium was on him then, and then the shroud
first, and then the
simultaneously.
shroud. If these are the same cloths, okay? Assuming they're the same, the sudarium would have been put on first, then the shroud.
Okay, and it was when
Because remember,
Jesus.
the shroud is the package.
Okay, so at that time on the Saturday, both cloths were on him simultaneously, and
Mm-hmm.
then when he resurrected, you're saying that's Jesus put the sudarium separate from the shroud. You're saying that's how it happened.
Yes.
Okay, I got you. All right, fair enough. And the other thing I wanted to confirm with you about what you said. So the shroud itself as a cloth, just by itself, there's nothing that's inconsistent with a first century burial shroud for Jews to your mind, or is there something that's
There is, unfortunately.
okay?
Yeah,
What is it?
unfortunately, there is some inconsistencies there. One of the inconsistencies is it's a tight wrap. Okay, first century burials are a tight wrap. Again, it's the whole wrap the body tightly to keep the bones together. That's the purpose of it. Here's one of the things we have to keep in mind. A first century shroud is not the same as a medieval shroud. They're different, and they serve different purposes. A medieval shroud is just a cloth you kind of drape over the deceased and just let it lie over the body. That's not the way a first century shroud works. A first century shroud is tightly wrapped around. Okay? So the problem is going to be, how does the dorsal image connect to the ventral image when it is so separated by a headspan or two? Okay? That's not going to be consistent with how a first century burial is done.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And the other thing you mentioned was the washing. So I just wanted to ask you about this. So from my understanding, there are different Jewish traditions in the first century. So, for example, you wouldn't wash, according to rabbinic tradition at least, if someone was violently killed or like they had a certain amount of blood. I forget what the amount was, but according to rabbinic traditions, you wouldn't wash the body in that case. Are you saying that's not true? There was like a universal practice. What?
There was a universal, pretty much a universal burial method in the first century. Now we have to understand that rabbinic tradition is quite late. It's quite late. It extends at least to the 5th century AD. Okay, so you can't take rabbinic tradition at face value. There's a lot of stuff in rabbinic tradition that is apocryphal. A lot of it. So what we'd have to base this on instead is, say, for example, archaeological burials that we find. And it does seem that at least there's a consistent use here of a consistent burial tradition across the board.
Gotcha. All right. All right. So at this point, I want to move on because one of the things that initiated this was obviously the modern wax study. But
Mm-hmm.
so I do want to get your take on wax and what you think some of the biggest objections are. But including in that, I'm kind of curious. Are you familiar with the other physical dating techniques that Giulio Fonte's used? So like the FTIR spectroscopy dating technique, the Raman spectroscopy technique, and the mechanical tensile strength test that they did. And the reason I'm bringing that up, well, I'll bring that up as a follow-up, but are you familiar with those tests as well? So yeah, what's your take on the waxes?
I'm slightly familiar with his infrared one. I don't find it to be a good one. Okay. I think it suffers from much of the problems that we find with the other methods, honestly. Again, a lot of it sounds like a method that was created to date the shroud. So I've got deep reservations about those methods from Fonte. Okay. Again, in some ways it's the same methodological concerns. So I would really like to see a good solid methodology here being used.
Okay. And here's one thing that I wanted to get from you because even if I assume all of the detailed critiques that I'll get from you about waxes in
Mhm.
a second are true, and let's pretend, yeah, okay, the other techniques they're all erroneous, they're all flawed in some way. The thing for me, the thing that has me slightly saying, yeah, I'm not going to be agnostic. I think it's probably true, even if it's a weak case, is the fact that they all overlap. Now, the only way that if they're all erroneous, why would they all overlap with their ranges to the first century? Um, the only way you can explain that is fraud if it's not because it's a huge coincidence. So, like, okay, is
Well, it's
that
a huge coincidence that it's all coming from the same authors too.
so? Okay, so the only thing with that, and again, I know you don't know Giulio Fonte, but I call him a friend. I do know him.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not plausible to my mind.
I'm not going to cast aspersions on your friend, but some of his methodology leaves something to be desired. It really does. So, you know, is this somebody who wants to believe something so much that he is taking shortcuts? I don't know. But it does, it's the same people who are doing these techniques. So, yeah, okay, it might all converge, but that doesn't mean that the techniques are solid. That means it could potentially mean that the authors are biased. That's what it could mean. We can't discount that. That's a real possibility, especially given the fact that they have demonstrated bias in the past.
Okay, so and just to clarify, and you don't have to worry about her. This is about truth, kind of thing, right? Not I'm going to be asking them to respond directly to this and giving them their say. So this is your time to have your say. Just out of curiosity, to clarify with that overlap, right? Because that it is true that the error bars, the only way they overlap is over the first century. So would you agree that the only way that could happen, if it's not true, the only way that could happen is through a purposeful effort? Is there some
No.
accidental way that could happen?
Oh, sure, there's an accident way that could happen. Absolutely. I mean, in the case of, say, the waxes method, there's definitely adverse events that could create that result to look first century. It's really second century is what that result came out to be. Okay. It wasn't first century, it was second century, but there's there are events that could cause that to legitimately happen. Okay. Because one of the things with the waxes method is it gives you the oldest possible date, not the youngest. There is no event that can make a piece of linen look younger than it is under the waxes method. There's only events that can make it look older than it is.
Based on the deterioration. That
Deterioration, a fire could cause deterioration. Bleaching, that's a big one. That's a big thing. That can make your linen appear 500 years older than it is. Easily.
Okay. So a couple of questions then on this front. So
Mm-hmm.
the thing again, I'm pro Shroud and stuff like that, but I think your most substantive objection that's causing me doubts is when you mentioned that. Look, it's just given the method. Let's just grant everything. It's second century or even at best late first century. It can't be dated back to the early first century, which is when
Yeah.
Jesus was. So that's disconfirming evidence if that's true. So I just want to get your take. Can you explain like what that why is that the case? And yeah.
Okay. Again, it comes down to the fact that the waxes method gives you the oldest possible date. And if you plot that properly on a curve, that's going to give you a late second century date. With the error bars, you might be able to nudge that into the late first century. But the problem is you can't nudge that into the early first century. That's beyond what your error bars permit. So then what's going to happen here, and I think this is one of the problems with the study, the 2022 study, is it says, well, close enough. Well, no, that's not close enough. You do have to be cognizant of the fact that dating is not commutative. Okay? Like, for example, if I did we won't use waxes here. Let's use carbon-14. I get a carbon-14 date of a sample, and it tells me it's 1000 AD, plus or minus 100 years. And then I get a second sample that dates to 850, and plus or minus 100 years. Now, those two samples overlap in the error bars. But I can't say then that the first sample dates to 750 AD. Each sample has to stand on its own measurement. This is how good dating methodology works. Is you might be able to take those two samples and take the average and say, oh, well, these two samples came from the same context, therefore it's probably around 980. You can do that. That's permissible. Okay? But you can't say the first sample dates to earlier than outside of its error range. Okay? That's not a bona fide method in chronometric procedures. So when we look at, say, the dating used in the 2022 study, it's late second century according to their own measurements. But, the whole close enough thing is not good method. It's flawed.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. I had a follow-up question and it just went out of my head. So, what was it? Oh, yes. Okay. So as I kind of told you, again, unfortunately, due to language issues, I did have to split it up. I couldn't have you guys on the same show dialoguing, which would have been ideal. But I am going to be doing a follow-up where I'm going to raise all of your objections so that we can get the actual authors. How do they respond to this? And I just want to leave it to you on the waxes. Like, what are the main objections or questions or something that you think is most important to get at the truth that you would want me to pose to the authors?
I think the waxes method is deeply flawed. Okay, it's got systemic problems. When they validate it, the sample size is way too small. Okay, 9 samples does not make is not sufficient for a general purpose dating method. If they want us to believe that this is more than just a one-purpose dating method, i.e., it's just used to date the shroud, they've got to do more work here. A lot more work. The data has been curated. That's not a good thing. That's a really bad thing. They're not just taking random linen samples and testing them. They're picking out the ideal linen samples. So there's bias in the sampling. That's a problem. That's a significant problem. There was confirmation bias, probably with the 2019 study, because in 2017, they were already using waxes to date the shroud before they had even confidence that the method worked. That's a serious problem. This and then implies that they might have curated their data to fit the result that they had already published in 2017. I think the whole failure to explain or identify data anomalies is not good. It's really bad. The samples that date from 200 BC to 3500 BC all have the same age factor. Why is that? What's the cause of that? Why do we get a parabolic curve and then it goes flatline around the Common Era? That needs to be explained. That's a really, really strange curve. Very odd. It's, I've said it before. When you see a curve that strange, it's usually screams either incompetence or bias. Okay, so that anomaly has to be explained somehow. The failure to properly justify their Q range. The Q range is basically a magic number that converts their measurements to something intelligible. And they've made it 1.5 to 4.0. Exactly. That's a very strange range. You know, they need to justify that too, and that hasn't been properly done. And then there's finally the problem of bleaching. You know, bleaching is very intractable, just because the way bleaching was sometimes done in the ancient world. You can't always know if a cloth has been bleached. In a lot of cases, bleaching leaves no residue of any kind or even chemical change on a piece of linen. So they have to find out, at least justify or account for how bleaching is going to affect the dating. Because when they showed in their 2019 study the bleached versus unbleached fabric, there was a difference there of 500 years. That's not insignificant. A 500-year difference is very significant to the outcome of the results. So if they're measuring fabrics that have been bleached in antiquity, that could mean that those fabrics are a lot younger on their graph. They're a lot younger than their graph shows. So I think what's going to be the rub here is that we are dealing with a method that has systemic issues. I think the method needs a rethink. Okay, this is not to disqualify the method. I think they could make this work, but it's going to require a lot more rigor. It's going to require a complete reevaluation and rethink of the method. And I think it does have potential. I mean, definitely the method has potential. I'd love to see this method work. I mean, frankly, if we had a method that could date linens out of the box, that'd be fantastic. I'd love that. That'd be great. I mean, that's then another tool we can use for dating. And I'm always game for another dating tool. We need that. But it needs to be validated. It needs to go through blind sampling. It needs to have a proper sample size. It needs to eliminate that confirmation bias. It needs to account for its data anomalies. It needs to justify its Q range, and it needs to basically take into account adverse events that could change the dating.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm gonna ask you 3 questions at once, just so we can move on. If that's
3 at once,
is that okay?
I prefer 1 at a time.
Okay. Well, as long as you've got time, I'm good to go then. So I'll ask it what. So the first thing I wanted to ask is about the bleaching issue, because from my understanding, their chemists have, like Dr. Ray Rogers, have written papers saying that you can tell the difference. Something to do with the lignin and detectable in that. So that there has been some work in the peer review from chemists saying that there is a way to tell and that sort of thing. Are you aware of any of these studies? And
I'm aware of those studies. I don't think they're very good studies. Okay.
Okay.
The fact is, a lot of linen was just sun bleached. It's just sun bleached. How do you tell that from somebody who's wearing linen out in the sun? You can't. How can you tell that from someone who hangs their linen up on a clothesline to dry? I mean, people have been doing this for millennia, putting their linens after wash out on a clothesline to make it look whiter. You can't tell the difference. It's just not possible to tell the difference between something that's been sun bleached and something that has been unbleached. There's just no way to do it for a sample from antiquity. It can't be done. It doesn't leave physical evidence. Okay. Now, chemical bleaching, sure. Chemical bleaching, fine. Yeah, sure. If you've got chemical bleaching, yeah, then you could probably tell it. But simple sun bleaching, no. No way.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because yeah, just looking at the study, yeah, it has to do with basically when you bleach or something. They're saying even sun bleaching, that removes lignin, which is detectable, and most associated flax impurities. And then there's also this issue of the banding. There are bands of different color on the shroud. So like that's how they've detected that, or that's how Ray Rogers at least was detecting that and stuff. But okay, I take your point. You disagree with that paper kind of thing. So all right, the other thing with the wax that I wanted to talk to you about, because this is something I disagree with. I heard your point, but I still disagree with it. Is on the 1532 fire, and I know that you say
I don't
when
think that I don't think that's a big deal,
yeah
honestly. But here's what I think is the problem with that. The problem with the 1532 fire is that it was set afire by the molten silver. Okay, silver melts at 962 degrees. That's dang hot. Okay, for linen to combust, it has to reach 310 degrees. Absolutely, it will not combust any lower than that. So at some point, that linen had to get well above 200 degrees. Now, I don't think this is a big issue for the dating, but I also don't think that, say, Fonte's um, heat tests were valid either.
Mhm.
One of the problems I have with Fonte's heat tests is that he doesn't tell us what bolt of linen he used. You go back to his paper where he did this, and he just tells you that it's from the Leotex factory. Doesn't tell you what the product number is. Doesn't tell you if the linen is bleached, unbleached, dyed, or treated. Any of those situations could affect the color of the heat testing. He doesn't tell you if it was done in a oxygen-free environment. That's also going to matter, because here's the thing: if the shroud was contained in a silver box and it got hit by that molten silver and set on fire, the reason it probably didn't burn up completely is because all the oxygen was taken out of the box. That could have caused it to be subjected to even higher temperatures without combustion. So I don't think I mean, he doesn't even show us the unheated sample.
Yeah.
So there's no control being shown on that in that paper. So I've got serious reservations about the methodology he used for those heating tests to determine what temperature to validate whether or not this was a problem.
Okay, so here I would go a different route than Cameron would in terms of the argument. Forget about Fanti
Mm-hmm.
for a second, because I agree. Yeah, you should show the original and stuff like that. But we have absolute scientific confirmation, and even skeptics. Like I'm talking atheists like Dr. Colin Berry, who's a chemist. He's a famous shroud skeptic, a medievalist. He thinks the shroud images were created through a type of scorch. He calls it the toastograph hypothesis, right? But we can prove that the images and the shroud and the area where the samples were taken, we know for a fact they were not subjected to temperatures in excess of 200 degrees, because if they were, like such as the scorch marks where the silver went through, they would, through ultraviolet fluorescence studies, they would fluoresce red. At temperatures that would be a hot scorch. There's So if you have a very light scorch, something under 200 degrees, this is why Colin Berry is working with very light scorches and stuff like that, because that ultraviolet fluorescence study rules out your theory. So
I would
if
have to look at that, but I've got reservations about some of those ultraviolet fluorescent stuff. Okay,
like the study itself, you're saying, or
the technique itself. Okay, but I'd have to look into that deeper. I haven't looked into that per se.
No problem. Yep, and I'll send you because this is in one of the peer-reviewed papers itself from Stirp back in 1978, and we'll get into that. So, okay. So last question on this, and then we'll move on, is about the textile itself. Because you are an archaeologist and an Egyptologist, my gosh, you work with mummy wrappings and linen textiles and stuff like that. So on the the shroud as a textile itself, so not the size or anything like that. Some skeptics will say, well, look, it's very advanced. It could only come in, a herringbone weave, 3-to-1 twill, Z twist. This could only come into effect in the medieval period. Based on the shroud as a textile, do you think it's consistent with the first century? Do we have any similar complicated weaves, or is the shroud totally beyond anything that could have been produced in the first century?
Well, there were some complicated weaves, especially coming out of Egypt. Okay, so there were some complicated weaves. Whether or not the herringbone pattern was, I don't know. Honestly, I haven't looked that closely at the herringbone pattern per se. But we do find some complicated weaves from time to time. So it's not every piece of linen from Egypt was a simple weave. Okay, so there's times when they use other, because they were quite skilled with the loom.
Okay, and okay, yeah, and they had, so obviously they did have the specific types of looms that were needed to make it a textile of that sort in the Middle East at that time. Because I know some people have said, no, it didn't come until the late 200s AD. It didn't arrive from India. It didn't arrive to the Middle East until after the first century. You're saying that's not true. They did have these looms.
They did have some complex weaves, and they did have some complex looms. Okay, but whether or not they had the herringbone pattern, we're going to have to see if there's extant material that shows that.
Gotcha. All right, cool.
And frankly, only an expert on linen could tell you that.
Fair enough. All right, cool. So now I'm going to...
And there are those people out there. There are those people out there who just specialize in a particular type of artifact, like linens. Okay? So they're out there. You get ceramicists, you get people who do textiles, you get people who do furniture, like yours truly.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Okay, furniture is yours.
Yeah, I did my PhD on ritual furniture. Nice. So that includes woodworking, metal inlay, lapidary work, all that stuff.
Okay, cool. I didn't know that. So all right, cool. All right, awesome. So I'm going to ask you a fun question now. And don't blame the pro-shroud crowd. This is uniquely me as a philosopher thinking, and I always get weird looks when I say it, but I'm kind of curious. Look, you're a Christian. You're open to miracles, even if you're not open to considering it as a historian. You are as a thinker, as a person,
Sure.
So let's pretend the shroud is 7th century and or 14th century, whatever you want, kind of thing. And so it didn't cover the historical Jesus. My argument is that that's totally irrelevant. Look, the scientific evidence that I base my belief that the images were formed miraculously, that's still the same. Nothing changes, whether it's 7th century or 30 AD or medieval. So for me, I don't even really care when it dates from. God can do a miracle at any time in history. So for me, I just focus on, can we prove it's a miracle or not? What are your thoughts on that? Am I crazy? Am I nuts? Or do you think there's merit?
Well, you're not nuts. Okay, you're not nuts.
That's good.
But I'm not a psychologist either.
All right.
So take that for what it's worth.
I was feeling good, but
that's going to raise very interesting philosophical question. I actually, when I read that, I thought, wow, that is actually a pretty interesting question. When does pareidolia become a miracle? Now, do you know what pareidolia is?
Yep. Like where you see pattern, like an image of a face on Mars or something. Like that.
Yeah. You see a puppy in the clouds. There's not a real puppy up there, but your mind fills that in. Now, this can come into play, like, for example, when does, say, for example, a holy image on a piece of toast rise to a miracle? For some, that will be a miracle. Okay? And what we're talking about here is private or personal interpretation in miracles. Okay? Now, let me give you an example. Let's say that you pray to God and you say, do I go to seminary? Do I get a theological education? And you do a flip and find to the Bible. And you come across the verse that says, go forth and do likewise. And you take that as a sign to go to seminary. That's a private or personal interpretation. It's not an interpretation that's meant for the edification of the church. Okay? Sometimes there's miracles that work that way too. Whereas you find a miracle that you see an image, like, for example, Constantine seeing the cross in the sky. We wouldn't call that a miracle for the edification of the church, but it might have been a miraculous event for him. So sometimes we do encounter this, where people go, I was walking down the street and someone walked up to me and goes, hey, yeah, I don't know if you know this, but I think your house might be on fire. And so you rush back and you check it and you go, well, it's starting to burn. I got to put it out. Wow, that was a miracle that, God put someone in my path to tell me that my house might be on fire. Okay, can you explain that through normal everyday events? Yeah, sure. Can you also explain that as a personal miracle or a personal revelation? Yeah, you can explain it that way too. How do you want to receive that message is going to be the question. Church authorities will be resistant to the idea that that's a miracle because it doesn't rise to the level of ecclesiastical authoritative standards. But is it a miracle? Maybe. Is it an everyday event? Maybe.
Okay, so I guess my follow-up to that would be, so I hear what you're saying, right? The philosophers, including Gary and C.S. Lewis, there are different types, I guess, of things called miracles. And I'm kind of curious, so you mentioned, I personally wouldn't even feel comfortable labeling those a miracle. It's just God's providence or not, and whether you recognize it. But regardless of that,
sure.
do you see that there could be other types of miracles? Like, is there a difference between Jesus's resurrection as a miracle and the question of that providential, like, hey, someone warned me my house is on fire, and geez, I got to it just in a nick of time. Like, do you think that there's a difference between types of miracles, or
I think there is. There's definitely not all miracles are the same. You get like, for example, I would even say that there's some miracles that are just miracles of timing. Just miracles of timing. Like the Red Sea crossing. The crossing across the Sea of Reeds. That is a miracle of timing. It's not an unknown phenomenological or an unknown meteorological event in the Eastern Nile. It's called a wind set down. A wind blows into the east and actually blows the waters apart. This has been observed in nature. Okay? So, and we're even told in the text that the Lord sent a wind from the east. So it's a matter of timing that it's a miraculous event. It's not a event that we would call a supernatural event. We would call this a hypernatural event. An event that amplifies what's already found in nature. You can say the same for the 10 plagues of Egypt too. They're hypernatural events. They're not supernatural events.
Okay.
Christ walking on water, that's a supernatural event because that defies the laws of physics.
Gotcha. Yeah.
The resurrection is a supernatural event. But there are some events that are hypernatural, and those are also considered miracles. just because of the timing at which they occur.
So that's a great case in point, and I do make that distinction myself. Although I've never heard the term hypernatural, so that great. You taught me something new there. I'm going to keep that in mind. Yeah, the circumstances, like the timing, can be extraordinary in and of itself, and
Yeah,
yeah, I think for me, when I'm talking about the shroud images, I'm meaning it more like the resurrection, the formation. I think when we're
sure.
asking, are they supernatural or not? For lack of a better word, just because I try not to use that terminology because I know some atheists just object to it immediately. But no, there's no atheists here today, so I don't have to care. So
Well, imagine that.
there you go, there you go. But yeah, so in terms of my question, there you do in terms of a supernatural event, God could do a supernatural event that for the purpose of authenticating Christianity at any time. I mean,
Sure.
people believe in. Yep, you're okay. So I'm not crazy. So there you go.
You're not crazy, but I'm not a psychologist.
Sounds good. Just have to rub it in, don't you? All right. But,
You knew that was going to happen, though, right?
of course, I was waiting for
You opened yourself up for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So let's look at this question then. Are the shroud images actually supernatural, a supernatural miracle at all? And in the first place, I just want to ask you while you're here on the question of image formation, how these body images and bloodstains got onto the shroud. I know that you've mentioned you think it's some kind of artwork, but what specifically would be your best guess? Is it like a traditional painting with a paintbrush? Do you think it's some
No.
other or technique? How are they created?
I have some ideas about this, but I'm not really prepared to comment on them. We're doing some work on this to see if there are alternate methods of image formation. Because there are some techniques used in history that didn't always make it into the history books. So we're pursuing some avenues along those lines. But I would say of the options that you gave me, power rubbing, traditional painting, I don't think it's either one of those.
Gotcha. So that's great. When if you're doing actual experimentation to see what the results are, please, if you're enjoying today, you're welcome back because I want to get those results and report on them and stuff. So
Sure.
Cool. All right. So let's see. So in terms of image formation, then obviously you are doing your own experiments to test a novel technique and that sort of thing. So in addition to having to be consistent with medieval technology or earlier technology, right? Because we agree it can't be later than the 1350s kind of thing. But you also have to replicate what I call I know you're going to hate it, but the minimal relevant features. So I'm kind of copying Gary's minimal facts. With the shroud images, there are what are called these minimal relevant features. There are certain physical or chemical properties that I think any technique you're using has to replicate these. So I'm kind of curious. In the first place, are you familiar with Stirp's scientific findings from back in 1978 when they actually studied the shroud? Do you know what some of the main features are that need to be replicated, or what's your take on them?
Like for example, the fiber being colored on one side only, that sort of thing. I think most of that could be replicated. Okay. But I also have some issues with some of the method that Stirps has done. Okay. I'm particularly some of the chemical tests I think are really not great.
Okay.
Like for example, they're like the fluorescimine tests. You know, some of those tests that were supposed to be proving the presence of blood. I think those are really dodgy tests. Really dodgy. Those tests are not discriminating enough to make those determinations. Particularly, I mean, in both cases, the ones that test for, say, blood proteins and hemoglobin are. I mean, one of the things you find in, say, forensics textbooks, for forensics textbooks, they all say this. Those quick tests are a first test. They're not a confirmation test. They are subject to false positives across the board. And that's because the mechanisms that are used to make them work. They're not discriminating enough to basically tell the difference between blood proteins and egg yolk. They're not that discriminating. They're also subject, like, for example, the ones that test for heme. They are not discriminating enough to tell the difference between heme and metal oxides, like iron oxide. If the shroud has red ochre, that would provide a false positive for those heme tests, which is why every forensics textbook tells you that you have to confirm an initial quick chemical test with a microcrystalline assay. That's the only way you can be sure it's actually blood. You need that microcrystalline assay. You don't have that, you don't have any confirmation that these tests are valid.
Okay, so first of all, I'm glad that you've kind of looked into the chemical tests and stuff like that have been there in terms of paint versus blood and that sort of thing. I'm just kind of curious, of any of the tests on the chemical end that STIRT performed, do you think any of them are determinatives? And
No.
For example, okay,
They're all quick tests. They're all quick tests. They're all subject to false positives.
okay.
All of them. And false positives for the stuff where they're supposed to be ruling out. That's the problem. Okay, so if they're supposed to be ruling out iron oxide, red ochre, then you can't do a test for heme. Because the whole way that the heme tests work is through reducing heme to iron oxide that is then picked up by the quick test. That's the problem with those tests. That's why you have to do that microcrystalline assay.
Okay. So I want to ask you about one specific test that that STIRP claims, and I'm believing from a chemistry perspective, they also say this is another test that is absolutely determinative. The proteases test, they say, is a falsification because in the body images, obviously if you have a pigment, you'll have a gelatin binder, to hold the pigment kind of thing on together, as you kind of put it. And those are composed of proteins because they're usually made of an animal product. Now, the protease test is an enzyme that would
breaks down protein.
Yeah. And they conducted that and said that there were no proteins in the body images. And if there's no proteins, then there can't be paint because there's no binder. What's your take on that test? Because from my understanding, that is an absolute falsification test. Is that not the case, or what's your take there?
Well, they did do some other sort of like fluorescimine. They did fluorescimine tests and found positives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's presence of protein. That's what those tests do. They show the presence of protein.
But that was in the blood, right? Not the body image.
That's in the blood. But then again, too, the body image doesn't have large amounts of that with the pigment anyway. So it would be the amount of protein that would be used in a binder is really small anyway. Really small. I mean, you could make a large batch of paint with a single egg yolk. It's really uncanny how much paint you can make with that.
All right.
So, and the body image seems to be mostly on the extremities where we find, say, the coloration. It's on the extremities, the outline. So you're not going to find much of that in the body image itself.
Okay. Yeah, because I was gonna follow up on that. Okay, so I guess I will. Okay, so no, it's not loading up. So I'll ask you this question while I try to load that up. Then, so the other thing I wanted to ask you beyond the chemistry, in terms of still with the paint versus not. What about all the dozens of spectral tests that didn't find this? Didn't detect paint in any
Oh,
sufficient
yes, they
quantity?
did.
Okay. What
Oh,
were those?
yes, they did. Let me give you the probably one of the clearest examples of this is the Adler and Heller paper of 1980, the one in applied optics.
Mhm.
The big paper everyone quotes to say there was no paint. Okay, that's the one everyone quotes to say there's no paint. That figure 2 is incredibly interesting. Now they're going to say that this is hemoglobin. This is a heme product, a blood product, based upon a peak found at 550 nanometers. Okay, but there's also a peak at 630 nanometers. Dry blood doesn't have a peak at 630, but red ochre does. The fact is that the two curves, if you're familiar with that figure, those two curves are almost identical. Like curve B is on the absorbance curves for that is almost identical to the absorbance curve for red ochre, pigment red 102. And curve A, the spectrogram for A, is almost identical to the absorption curve for cinnabar, or what's called vermilion, pigment red 106. They found it. They found those pigments. Those curves can't be faked. You know, one of the things I often say is that people lie, but data doesn't. Their data showed pigments. It didn't show hemoglobin. It didn't show blood products. It showed artist pigments.
Gotcha. Okay, so here's what I was asking you. You're in the interest of truth. Yeah, you are absolutely correct. There were various pigments found on the shroud as well as other particles, but I think Stirp attributes these to contamination as opposed to yourself.
Well,
Where
okay.
and that's why I wanted to ask you about the spectral tests in particular, where
Yeah, the spectral test showed pigments. They definitely showed pigments. They didn't show hemoglobin. That's just I think that's wishful thinking that it showed blood. That's really wishful thinking. Now there might be blood there. I don't think they found it. Okay.
okay.
Now I know everyone in the pro Shroud community vilifies Macron. Okay.
Yeah.
But if what he says is true, and that he found red ochre at 1,000-to-1 ratio, that is one heck of a big ratio. That's three orders of magnitude difference. That's not a small difference. That's a big difference. So if you're going to say that there's no ochre on there, and you're coming up with spectrographic curves that show there's ochre and cinnabar, and there's that 1,001 particle ratio, or 1,000-to-1 particle ratio, that's really compelling evidence that there was actually pigment on there. And Stirp found it. They just didn't report it. Data doesn't lie.
Okay, well, yeah, I would just say from the dozens of spectral tests, they didn't find paint in any in the.
Can you recognize a absorption curve for red ochre if you saw it?
Well, no, but let me.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Most people can't. Most people can't identify a reflective curve, a reflective spectrograph, or an absorption one. And now you're dealing with two pigments with two different curves for each pigment. Yeah, most people are not going to recognize that.
Okay, so here's the thing that I wanted to ask though on the spectral thing, and this will be my last thing on that. But
Mhm.
so for example, right, if it is covered, actually two last things because there's something that I want to ask for you. But on the X-ray fluorescence, this is something that would easily pick up heavy metals like iron in an iron oxide pigment, right? If it was to the degree that Macron said, which every even Shroud skeptics who believe there is this paint disagree with Macron's findings on this front. But that would have been picked up by an X-ray fluorescence test. Instead, we found that the iron is in uniform amounts, both on image and off image.
Sure.
And, okay, that's not
Look,
a problem.
Sure, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. Look, here's the thing with I think this is one of the problems we get into with this whole thing. Is I think we're back to that black or white fallacy thing, where we're either going, oh, it's a miracle, or there's pigment. There's a third option here. Okay, there's at least two perfectly good reasons why there could be pigment on the shroud while it's still being a supernatural creation. Okay? Two perfectly good reasons. And there's at least three possible reasons why there could be pigment on the shroud. Okay? The first reason is red ochre's an insecticide. It's been used for millennia as an insecticide. It was used in ancient Egypt as an insecticide. It's why they paint barns red. It's red ochre paint painted on a barn to preserve the wood. Okay?
Interesting. I didn't know that, but okay, yeah.
So somebody could have taken a wash of red ochre, light wash of red ochre, given the shroud a bath to preserve it from weevils. Okay? That's a possibility. A possibility we can't rule out. The second possibility is it was retouched. Some artist later on said, oh, the shroud's fading, or saw it was a low contrast and wasn't enough for the faithful. So they retouched it. And there's definitely, I think, some evidence of retouching at the very minimum. Because I think, like, for example, a cinnabar is painted over top of the ochre. So I think that's a valid potential here that there's that possibility of retouching. And the third possibility is that some or all of the image was created with these pigments, but not necessarily a painting, which is one of the avenues we're pursuing. So there's a possibility that this was used to create the image too. So all three of those could be possible. It's an insecticide, or it's retouched, or it's used in the creation of the image. So I don't think the presence of these pigments is a showstopper. And I think it does a huge disservice to deny its presence. It's clearly there. I don't think there's any doubt that the pigment is there. The question is, why is it there?
All right, got you. Yeah, well, I fully agree with your point that, look, the chemistry of the shroud, whether it's paint or not, there are other mechanisms that don't use paint, right? So it's not the black or white fallacy. I agree with that. But one last thing, I want to mention this because I want to give you credit for coming up with something unique by using the D-Stretch program. So I'll just show that that's not what I wanted to show. So this is the image of the D-Stretch program. And you mentioned that these purple areas prove that this thing, I think you mentioned in your own words, it was like loaded. Let me know if I misquoted that, but it's loaded with red ochre pigment.
Yeah,
and that's
the whole image is. It's not just the bright purple areas, though. We've got to be careful about that. And frankly, this is one of the things I really hate about about YouTube is the resolution's too small.
Oh,
If you zoom into that image, you see patches of purple all over it. You can't see that on the YouTube video.
is it
Okay.
I can make it a bit here, I'll make it full screen.
Yeah, you just can't see it on the YouTube.
Okay. So
It's just the resolution. The resolution on YouTube doesn't do it justice.
all right. So
And what I probably should have done is blown it up when I did the video. Because if you zoom in on like the facial regions, you'll see patches of purple.
okay, so what I wanted to ask you about, because I looked into this and stuff, and I've noticed if you were able to see it on there, that all of the purple areas, they're not on the images of the shroud, but they're around the scorch. And there is Stirp did find iron oxide around the scorches and in some of the burnt blood areas. So but yeah, that's what I was going to raise as kind of a pushback. And what's your take on that?
Well, the take on that is if this is a pigment, it's gonna flow with water. It's going to be carried by the water, and we do know that the shroud got wet when it was quenched. Okay, so we do know that they used water to put out the burning when it was burning. So if there had been ochre in it, it would be carried by the water as the water evaporated at the edges of the garment.
Okay,
So that's just hydrologic separation. That's all that is. It's the same thing like when you write in a quill pen on a piece of paper, and then the piece of paper gets wet. You know, a drop of water falls on it, and the ink spreads out with the drop of water. Same thing.
Yeah, the color would be color runoff and stuff like that.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, and that's all that is color runoff.
Okay. Okay, so I know that you're the guest, but we're sharing. I hope you don't mind me contradicting and stuff like that. But I just want to share with you. So even Walter McCrone admitted that there is no color runoff. This was one of the problems, is that the water dousing during the 1532 fire, it didn't cause this expected runoff effect, and he had to come up.
How would you see that? How would you notice that?
Oh well, through certain X-ray tests, you would find iron oxide, running off the images. They're
using. Look, all these guys from Stirp, including Chrome, are using tapes. They're all using tapes. That's going to give you a limited view of what's happening on the internals of the fabric. Even Barry, what's his name?
Barry Schwartz.
Barry Schwartz. He criticized McCrone's technique for using tapes. Well, Stirp's using tapes too. They're all using tapes. Everyone's using tapes. So you're going to have some difficulty seeing that runoff using tapes, because that's going to be internal to your fibers of your fabric. You're only going to be able to see that using a technology that differentiates the spectrum.
Okay, but you do realize with Stirp, though, unlike McCrone, they studied the shroud. They were there in person.
I know they're there in person, but they were doing their analysis using tapes still. Yeah, they were there taking the tapes, but you're not going to be able to see that runoff clearly. Not with the human eye.
Okay, so the last thing I want to say on the paint thing is I want to just ask you, you mentioned that you find Stirp's tests, chemical tests that they did, were inconclusive at best.
Yeah, I think they're inconclusive at best.
Okay. Do you think that it's the same with Walter McCrone's studies? Because he used the fluorescimine test. He used a lot of the.
I think it's the same with McCrone's studies too.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So yeah,
I think the only benefit that, say, McCrone adds is his 1,000-to-1 ratio. That's a lot of pigment, man. That's a lot. That's 3 orders of magnitude. That would be really hard to fake.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. I'll let that go. Again, I will just say, like, just again for you, even skeptics who agree with McCrone today admit that he was wrong on the ratio. Like, it's not loaded with paint. They say that, well, the paint fell off and stuff. They try to explain, you know, Macron's theory has been kind of falsified according to even.
Have you ever worked with red ochre?
Me personally, no, but I know people who have.
It gets everywhere.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
It gets everywhere.
Fair enough.
Okay.
I'll ask. I'll ask.
It makes a mess. I mean, it really makes a mess. It's you know, you think, okay, I'm adding a little dollop to this painting, and then you find your hands are covered with it, your face is covered with it, you've got it down your pants and legs. You're just putting a little dot. Yeah, you're putting a little dot on a painting, and you're going, how did it get all over me? Red ochre's like that. It's just it's such a strong colorant of with such a fine grain, is it just gets everywhere. It's crazy.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. All right. So let's get away from the paint, because that isn't determinative. We need more than that. I'm just kind of curious in terms of the features, the physical features, and I want to see. I'll just list them off, and you tell me if you agree with it or not. But okay, so there's the obvious, the photo negativity or the quasi-negative image. You know, the black or white thing that was proven 100 years ago. You agree with that as one of the features that needs to be replicated. It needs to be
Sure.
made. Okay.
I don't think that's a difficult feature to replicate, but go on.
You're correct. Yeah, you're right. That's basically only traditional painting fails that criterion.
Yeah.
Okay, the three-dimensional or topographic information encoded into the Shroudman's images.
Okay, I got a problem with that one.
Okay.
That's a modern anachronism that's been superimposed on the image. Here's one of the things. It's kind of like using. Have you ever used the emboss algorithm in Photoshop?
No, I've never used Photoshop, but I know people who've used what
Oh,
you're saying.
oh,
I don't even have a cell phone, man. I'm terrible.
oh, dude.
Yeah, I'm a weirdo on that.
Okay, there's a feature in Photoshop called emboss, and what it does is let's say you've got a let's say the letter A, and you want to make it look 3D. You want to make it look 3D. There's an algorithm that will actually make it look 3D, and it's called the emboss algorithm. Okay. Now, that 3D projection is using one of those algorithms to give it three-dimensionality. The information is not in the shroud itself, but you can take that image and add the algorithm to it to make it look 3D. It's the algorithm that is superimposing the three-dimensionality onto the image, not that it has the image inherently. The image inherently has that three-dimensionality. So we got to be really, really careful here not to ascribe something to the image that is a modern affectation, an anachronism.
Okay, so if I phrased it, the technical way of phrasing it is there is in the image itself, there is this topographic or depth information encoded in the image darknesses and lightnesses, or the density of the body image color.
There's also shadows on there too. There's a lot of inconsistency in that image. There's a shadow under the bottom lip.
Oh, okay.
There is the fact that the image has a bright patch on both sides of the head, where there should be density, and ears. It's got no ears. But there's a bright patch there where there shouldn't be one. That should be, if this is a picture of a head, there should be hair going all the way around it.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so that is another one of the features, like the sides of the image and as well the top of the head. They're just
Mm-hmm.
not encoded, and the image process only it attenuated after 4 centimeters, so it couldn't be a burst of light or something like that. It only encoded up to 4 centimeters. So this is another feature, but I don't get into all of that. So okay, so you would agree if I phrased the 3D thing properly with the in terms of the depth, you're good with that, so long as I'm careful in how I pronounce it. Would you also?
I don't think there's 3D imaging in the image. I don't.
Okay. So what
I
do you
think
mean?
that's a modern. I think that's a modern anachronism.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. What about uniformity? So the body images are, in terms of their color, within its narrow range. It's like plus or minus a couple percent or something like that. But they are uniform in color. Each individual fiber is colored individually, and they're uniform in color. So it's where there's darknesses, it's from the concentration of the fibers. It's not because one fiber is darker than another. Um, would you Do you agree with that? That's a feature proven and that needs to be
It's
copied.
hard to say. I'd have to look at that in more detail.
Okay. Another one is famous one is body image superficiality. So that the color is only on the very superficial uh, surface of the cloth, the top 2 to 3 fibers of a thread, and on the
Yep.
fiber, it's only in the primary cell wall. You agree?
Yep. Sure.
Okay,
Don't have
cool.
a problem with that.
Okay. And then the other one is this one's a bit complicated to understand, but they've shown that uh, whatever form the image is, it traveled along a rectilinear or curvilinear path. So it's not like gas or like gas diffuses in all directions, right? So it's not like a straight
Mm-hmm.
line vertical process. Like that, whatever form the shroud image is was straight line vertical. That's why you don't have the ears. That's why you don't have these side images and stuff like that. It was a straight line vertical.
Which is kind of weird anyway. Because again, this thing is supposed to be wrapped around the body. Why don't we have image fragmentation?
Yeah, the
There should,
wraparound.
yeah,
Sorry.
you should. It's kind of like if you make a boot out of, I don't know if you've made boots.
I have not. No.
Okay, to make a boot, what you often do is you will take, say, newsprint and wrap it around your foot, and you cut it up and you flatten the image. Okay, that's your orthographic thing. But you also get these little extra pieces where the newspaper wrapped around more than once. Those are called image fragments or image shards. Okay? Because the wrapping was around the body, there should not only be the primary image, there should also be image shards.
I totally agree. So believe it, in my kind of response video to the first video you made, I actually totally agreed with you that you're correct that this wraparound fact this is how we know that it wasn't created through direct contact or some kind of gas diffusion method where it wrapped around a body. It couldn't, right? So that's what the scientists who studied it, the physicists, have determined. It was this vertical straight line process, whatever that was. It was either a rectilinear straight line or it was like a curve ball where it curved out, so like electrostatic mechanisms are curvy linear, but either way it was a direct vertical thing from where that position is. So that's a remarkable feature that will rule out a whole bunch of things. So okay, and last but not least, I guess to leave it here, in terms of there's no body images underneath the blood stains. Yeah.
The bloodstains are weird. The bloodstains are really weird.
Okay.
They
Shape, you mean? Or?
they first. I mean, one of the things is that they defy gravity. They defy gravity, especially the one that goes down the forehead and across the orbit of the eye.
Okay.
Okay, That one's really strange. That shouldn't happen. Not in a post-mortem prone body. That doesn't happen in a post-mortem prone body. Okay? I mean, first of all, blood leaking out of a post-mortem body is very minimal anyway. Once the body has been desanguinated. Okay? But after washing, you would not, and wrapping, you would not get blood flowing down over the orbit of the eye. It would go around the eye. I mean, you just do it naturally on your forehead without looking, and you just naturally you follow the gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So that blood stain's really strange. The other one that's really strange is the one that covers the hair.
Right. Yeah.
That's really bizarre. Okay. So there's some issues there with that. Okay.
Okay. So I think I hear what you're saying. You're kind of saying, like, as a negative argument, the blood stains are they're not natural patterns as blood would flow.
No.
Okay.
They're not natural patterns. They seem to be heavy in cinnabar. I got some reservations whether those are original.
Gotcha. Okay. So just kind of wrapping up this question, I think you kind of agree with the main features. And again, I'll send you links to the peer-reviewed papers and stuff, because if you're working on experimentation, we're going to be judging it based on these features and stuff like that, whether it works or not. But I think for you, primarily, if I've been listening to you, your decision about the images is primarily based on your evaluation of the blood stains. I think you're a little bit weak on the body, or
it's a multivariate thing.
Okay.
It's not just the blood stains. The blood stains are just sort of icing on the cake.
Okay.
It's you got to take all the issues here. Okay. I think the orthographic projection is a serious problem. Okay, I do think that's a serious problem. Okay, yeah. And I did finally watch your video of the. By the way, when you did that head image of me, you took it from the bottom of my beard, not my chin. Okay.
Okay. I know.
So that wasn't a fair comparison of where my eyes sit on my head. Okay. You made my face longer than it was because I had a larger beard.
Okay. So and that wasn't me. That was someone, an expert. I have no tech skills, so they did that. But I take your point.
Okay, so there is still that issue of where do the eyes sit on the head of the Shroud's image of the face. I think there's some issues too with where the weight is. Like, for example, it's almost all on the head. Almost all the darkest images is on the face. It's on the face itself, not on the body. Which is actually would be really, if this was a miracle meant to convince the faithful in the first century, it would be very odd. It would be very, very odd, because in many ways, say, this idea that the mind and the soul resides in the head wasn't a first century concept. Okay? It's a later concept. In ancient Israelite thought, the mind and the soul resided in the heart. In the heart. Makes sense. And the emotions in the kidneys. Okay. So for the body to be minimized and the head to be really accentuated in that way, not only is a problem for, say, ideas of the weight being expressed in the image, because the mass, your bulk of your mass is in your body. It's not in your head. So even if you have, say, like a radiation view here, that radiation is going to come from the mass, the total mass, not just in certain extremities. So I think there's a definitely an issue there. It doesn't look like a shroud that you would find in the first century. Not as we know it from any of our archaeological finds. It doesn't match the biblical description in the sense that the shroud was bound up. That's, I think, an issue. Um, I have to admit that the presence of pigments is a concern. It's not a showstopper, but it is a concern. The fact that it is consistent with Byzantine artwork is a concern. So I think when you take sort of the sum of it, I have some reservations about it being a first century burial cloth. So it's not just I'm not just going on one thing here. There's several pieces of evidence that I'm consulting when I make this evaluation.
Yeah, true enough. Yeah, I forgot. So there's the history aspect, and then on the miracle, I like I said, I separate that. So yep, okay, great. But I think so. It's pain.
But hey, if anyone wants to believe it's a miracle, a first century burial cloth of Jesus, go for it. I'm not opposed to that. If you want to believe that, that's a personal religious decision. But there's a if you want to believe it's a historical thing, then okay, we gotta. There might be a little tug there, and it's even a more of a tug if you want to say science proves it.
Yeah, because like on that philosophy thing, I think no. Look, if the evidence is against it, you should disbelieve it. If the evidence is for it, you should believe it. I don't kind of distinguish. Oh, it's a personal faith thing. Like no, God is a God of truth. Right? We're not supposed to believe.
I agree. I agree. God is a God of truth. Absolutely, I'm there with you all the way. But I also know that for some people, there's the desire to believe.
Gotcha. Okay.
And no evidence is going to convince them otherwise. And it's not a matter on which one should. It's not a hill to die on.
Fair enough. Okay.
Like Marian apparitions, you can't prove it. You can't disprove it. So unless these apparitions are saying something 100% contrary to the gospel, what's the issue?
Fair enough. Yeah. Again, we've got Kevin non-Tradicath in the audience. He would beg to differ on the Marian apparitions, but all right. Well, let me say this then. So obviously today you were kind of the main guest and the main focus, and I wanted to get your reasoning and stuff like that, and kind of probe a bit deeper and stuff like that. If I were in terms of the miracle question, which is most important to me, if I were to convince you about that there is actual blood on the shroud, it's not paint, and that the body images were not composed of paint. So taking that, and also come up with things about the anatomical stuff. Well, let me ask you that, because there have been various forensic medical experts, at least 24. I could go and name them, but people like Dr. Buckland, famous forensic pathologists and stuff like that, or as well others. And when they study the shroud images, they don't see these anatomical issues. And there's also been even a computerized anthropometric study, which falsifies your claim that the shroud man is anatomically disproportionate in some way. So in the first place,
he doesn't have much of a neck.
Oh, okay. But what's your take on why, if it's so obvious that it's disproportionate, why is every medical expert, with three exceptions that I can think of, they've all come out and said, yeah, this is anatomically accurate. And I'm not just talking Christians, even agnostics like Yves Delage back at the French Academy of Sciences. Where do you think
some of them believe? Some of them believe.
Okay.
I'm not saying all of them do, but some of them definitely believe. Others don't have a reason to. I mean, it's not exactly a, as I said, it's a low contrast image. So, they might be given the image a large benefit of the doubt. Who knows? It's hard to say unless I see this on a case-by-case basis.
Fair enough.
But there's definitely, there could be reasons why an anatomist would say it's anatomically correct. There's also reasons for people to say it isn't. Even sort of one of the things that's also very odd too is the whole crucifixion thing, the nails in the hand. That's very odd on the shroud. That's not characteristic of Roman executions. There was a time when it was said to be fashion. It was said that it had to be driven in the wrists.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But recent research has shown that's not the case. Roman executions weren't done that way. They were tied to the cross. And then what they had was a nail with a washer. They used a wooden washer with the nail and then drove that into the palm of the hand. So what happened was the tying kept the hand from slipping off. And the washer kept the hand from coming out of the nail, going through the nail.
Now, okay, so on that, just to follow up, from my understanding, there is no just one universal way of crucifying. The Romans would crucify in different positions.
They would crucify in different positions depending on the availability of wood. But in this particular case, they were using the stauros, the cross. Like they would use, if in cases where wood was scarce, they would use a single pole. Okay, but in the case of Christ's crucifixion, they were using a stauros.
Mm-hmm.
So in that particular case, they had beams that were set up already for crucifixion, and Christ was carrying the cross beam. And they would then tie him to the cross beam and hoist him up. So he had to be tied to it. He had to be tied and nailed to it in order to raise him up the stauros.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there's no question he had to be tied. But the question then is it in the hand palm or is it in the wrist? The thing with the wrist is if you hit that artery, you go fast.
Mm. Yeah.
There's an artery that runs through your wrist. You hit that artery, you're done in like 20 minutes. You're not going to be up there for hours.
Okay. So you're not just saying like, look, they crucified in this different way, but you're saying we can falsify historically that they would crucify in a way consistent with the shroud. You're saying, okay. All right, fair enough. Okay, so my kind of parting question as we kind of wrap up, first of all, let me ask you: is there anything else I missed in terms of topics, or do you think we kind of covered a good breadth of stuff to get to know you and where you're coming from on this stuff?
I think we covered a very broad base here. I will go with the evidence wherever it leads. I don't think your faith should rest on this, one way or the other. I don't think this is a good reason. I think we should get back into our Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
That's where our faith needs to be, is in God's word. So I think in some ways this is a bit of a distraction to the greater gospel message. If you want to believe it, that's fine. I don't have a problem with you believing it. I think that there's a lot that, but when you start making empirical claims, we need to evaluate those and judge them rationally, according to the evidence.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. Well, yeah, this is what I do have one last question about waxes, because you mentioned that one of your issues, and every skeptic I've seen mention this, is that they didn't test a sufficient sample size, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you are a professional Egyptologist, and then have connections, no doubt, with archaeologists who can get more samples. Is there any way that you would be able to facilitate maybe more testing, more samples? I don't know, by giving them access to more samples?
They would have to go to Egypt to do that. The fact is that Egypt has very strict export laws.
Yeah.
Very, very strict export laws. You can't just export samples out. Like, for example, if you want carbon-14 done at a foreign lab, you've got to apply for a license to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you're doing a broad range of samples all over Egypt, you need licenses for that. It's an arduous process. It's an arduous process.
Okay. And you have
now, if they take their lab, they're free to take their lab and set up in Egypt, and then they could probably access all sorts of things.
And do you know what's it like outside of, I know you're an Egyptologist, but like surely you have connections with like other archaeologists from outside. Is it harder or easier to get samples?
It's about the same. I mean, most countries now have very, very tight export controls, thanks to the UNESCO treaty. The UNESCO treaty really sort of clamped down on the cultural property thing. So getting samples out of certain countries these days is very difficult.
Okay. Yeah, maybe there's a way we can work on getting archaeologists to test it in their country.
Yeah.
Something.
I mean, that would be ideal. If you can get either the lab moved there or a duplicate setup in another country. That would be ideal, because then they could test a broad range of samples in their country.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But X-ray crystallography equipment isn't cheap.
Okay. Yeah, because
it's not cheap.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's why Julio and stuff were saying, like, that's why they could only test what they could get a hold of and stuff like that. So I was hoping, I wanted to see, like, is there anything we could do to advance it, falsify it, or
well, one of the things with one of the things it could do, because they are located, I believe, in Italy, is they can get stuff from across the Schengen area. They can get stuff from, say, France, Germany, even Spain. Those Schengen countries. They could get that material from there and bring it in, but they're probably already doing that.
Yeah.
But they do need a lot more samples. I mean, that almost goes without saying, and particularly samples in their area of interest. The ancient stuff I think is really interesting. Okay. That they tested samples from 200 to 3500 BC, I think is fascinating. I actually really appreciated that they did that. I don't think that helped their case, but I appreciated them doing it. Yeah. But I think they need a lot more if they're going to drive the conclusions they need.
Gotcha.
Or want.
Awesome. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I think that does it for all my questions. I want to say thank you so much for coming on to answer all my questions and kind of.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed this.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. Like I mean, you're a professional Egyptologist, archaeologist. Maybe at some point in the future, if you're comfortable and stuff, we could do like dialogues with the actual experts and stuff like that. And
that would take a lot of preparation on my behalf, and I don't have really time for that.
Okay.
So I probably wouldn't do that. Okay?
Fair enough.
But I'd be happy to come on for some other topics. Like you did mention at one point, bringing me on to talk about, say, the Exodus.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'd love that. Okay.
So I'd be happy to come on for that.
Excellent. All right. Awesome. So yeah, we'll keep in touch. And other than that, as I said, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. And I'll send you a link when we do the part 2 with Julio and Liberato, so you can get their direct answers to the objections. I think I noted down every one for you. So yeah, we'll answer that. And other than that, have a great week, everybody. All right, take care.